The guard's hand shot up like a wall of authority, blocking her path to the base she'd commanded for 3 years. "Ma'am, this is a restricted military facility. You need to turn around." Irene Hill stood there in civilian clothes, her accent thick with exhaustion from the red-eye flight, watching as junior personnel walked past her into the compound without question. They had no idea that the small European woman they were turning away was the commander of the entire SEAL West Coast Division. What happened next would change everything they thought they knew about leadership, respect, and the cost of assumptions. This is the story of the day Irene Hill was denied entry to her own command. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The California sun beat down on Naval Amphibious Base Coronado with the kind of relentless brightness that made everything look washed out and surreal. Irene Hill stepped out of the taxi at Gate 7, her civilian clothes rumpled from the overnight flight from Brussels, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than the regulation bun she typically wore. She'd been awake for 26 hours, racing back from a NATO strategic planning conference that had run 3 days longer than scheduled. In her hand, she carried a single leather briefcase. No uniform, no military identification visible. Just a tired woman in jeans and a blazer who happened to be one of the most powerful military commanders on the West Coast. The gate guard, a young sailor named Petty Officer Jenkins, barely looked up from his clipboard as she approached. His partner, Seaman Davis, was checking the identification of a contractor in a pickup truck, waving him through with practiced efficiency. The morning shift change had just occurred, and both guards were relatively new to this particular posting. "Good morning," Irene said, her Hungarian accent more pronounced than usual due to fatigue. She reached into her briefcase for her military identification card. "I need access to the command center." Jenkins finally looked up, his eyes scanning her civilian attire with immediate suspicion. "Ma'am, this is a restricted military installation. Do you have an appointment with someone on base?" "I work here," Irene replied simply, still searching through her briefcase. Her ID card wasn't in its usual pocket. She'd transferred items between bags during the layover in New York, and in her exhaustion, she must have missed it. Davis had finished with the contractor and now turned his attention to the situation developing at the pedestrian entrance. He was older than Jenkins, maybe 25, with the kind of confidence that comes from 6 months of gate duty and the certainty that he knew every possible scenario. "Ma'am, if you work here, you'll need to show proper identification," Davis said, his tone polite but firm. "Military ID, contractor badge, or visitor authorization." Irene set her briefcase on the small table beside the guard shack, methodically checking every pocket and compartment. The ID card wasn't there. She remembered now, with the kind of clarity that comes too late, that she'd placed it in the pocket of her uniform jacket for easy access during the NATO conference. That jacket was currently hanging in her quarters on base, exactly where she'd left it 5 days ago. "I seem to have misplaced my ID," she admitted, looking up at the two guards. "But I'm Commander Irene Hill. I run the SEAL West Coast Division. If you check your access roster, you'll see my name at the top." The two guards exchanged glances. Davis's expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed skepticism. Jenkins actually smiled, as if she'd just told an amusing joke. "Ma'am," Davis said slowly, as if speaking to someone who might not understand English well, "the commander of SEAL West Coast is a very important position. That person doesn't just show up at the gate in regular clothes without identification." "That person is standing in front of you," Irene replied, her voice remaining calm despite the growing frustration building in her chest. "I've just returned from Brussels. My flight was delayed, and I need to get to the command center for a briefing that starts in 30 minutes. Jenkins had pulled out a tablet and was scrolling through something, probably the base access roster. He looked up at Irene, then back down at the screen, his expression doubtful. "There's a Commander I. Hill on the roster, but what?" Irene asked, though she already knew what was coming. She'd faced this particular brand of disbelief more times than she cared to count. "But that can't be you," Jenkins said, his tone apologetic but certain. "You're like, what, 30? And you have an accent. The commander of SEAL West Coast would be what?" Irene's voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now. "American. Older, male, perhaps with grey hair and a chest full of medals." Davis held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Ma'am, no disrespect intended, but we have protocols. Without proper identification, we can't just let someone walk onto a secure military base, especially not into command areas. I'm sure you understand." What Irene understood was that this conversation was following a pattern she'd experienced throughout her entire military career. At 32, she'd risen to a position that typically went to officers, 20 years her senior. Her accent marked her as foreign, despite her American citizenship. Her appearance, small-framed, with delicate features that made her look even younger than her years, contradicted every stereotype about military leadership. She'd earned her position through a combination of tactical brilliance, language skills that made her invaluable in international operations, and a strategic mind that had impressed everyone from NATO commanders to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But none of that mattered to two gate guards who couldn't see past their own assumptions. "I understand your protocols," Irene said, her tone softening slightly. "Call the command center. Ask for Lieutenant Commander Patterson. He's my executive officer. He can verify my identity." Davis nodded, seeming relieved to have a concrete action to take. He stepped back into the guard shack and picked up the phone. Irene could hear him explaining the situation, his voice carrying through the open window. "Yeah, we've got a woman here claiming to be Commander Hill. No ID, civilian clothes. Says she just flew in from Brussels." "Uh-huh. Really? You're sure?" Irene watched as Davis's expression changed, moving from skepticism to confusion to something approaching concern. He spoke a few more words into the phone, then hung up and stepped back outside. "Ma'am, I apologize, but Lieutenant Commander Patterson says Commander Hill is currently in Brussels at a NATO conference and isn't expected back until tomorrow." For the first time since approaching the gate, Irene felt a genuine spark of alarm. Patterson knew her schedule had changed. She'd sent him an encrypted message from New York during her layover, informing him that she'd caught an earlier flight and would be arriving this morning instead of tomorrow afternoon. "Did Patterson receive my message about the schedule change?" she asked. Davis shrugged. "He didn't mention anything about that, ma'am. He was pretty clear that the commander isn't due back until tomorrow." Irene pulled out her personal phone, intending to call Patterson directly, but the battery icon showed red before the screen went dark. Dead. Of course it was. She'd been so focused on catching the earlier flight that she'd forgotten to charge it during the New York layover. "May I use your phone?" she asked. Jenkins shook his head. "Sorry, ma'am. Regulations prohibit unauthorized personnel from using military communication devices." "I'm not unauthorized personnel," Irene said, her patience beginning to fray. "I'm the base commander." "Without identification, we can't verify that," Davis replied. His tone had shifted from apologetic to something harder, more suspicious. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the gate. If you believe there's been some kind of miscommunication, you can contact the base through official civilian channels and sort it out." Irene stared at him, momentarily speechless. She was being denied entry to her own command. The absurdity of the situation would have been funny if it wasn't so infuriating, and if there wasn't an urgent briefing waiting for her, one that couldn't be delayed. Behind her, a black SUV pulled up to the vehicle checkpoint. She recognized it immediately. It belonged to the base security chief, Captain Wallace. He was ex-Marine, old school, and one of the few people on base who'd initially been skeptical of her appointment as commander. They'd developed a working relationship over the past 3 years, but it had never been warm. Wallace stepped out of his vehicle, his eyes landing on the scene at the pedestrian gate. He said something to the vehicle checkpoint guard, then walked over to where Irene stood, facing off against Jenkins and Davis. Captain Wallace approached with the measured stride of someone who'd spent 30 years in military service and had seen just about everything. His weathered face showed curiosity rather than concern as he took in the situation. Two gate guards standing firm against a small European woman in civilian clothes who appeared to be having some kind of disagreement about base access. "What's the problem here?" Wallace asked, directing his question to Davis rather than to Irene. "Sir, this woman claims to be Commander Hill," Davis explained. "She has no identification and is requesting entry to the command center. We've verified with Lieutenant Commander Patterson that the commander is currently overseas and not expected until tomorrow." Wallace turned his attention to Irene for the first time, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp and assessing. They'd sat through hundreds of briefings together, had disagreed on security protocols more times than either could count, but he knew exactly who she was. For a moment, Irene thought he might vouch for her, might cut through this absurd situation with a simple confirmation of her identity. But instead, Wallace's eyes travelled from her rumpled civilian clothes to her exhausted face, to her accent-tinged speech pattern, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Not disbelief exactly, but something close to it. Doubt. Or perhaps opportunity. "Commander Hill is supposed to be in Brussels," Wallace said slowly, not quite confirming or denying anything. "I caught an earlier flight," Irene explained again, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "I sent Patterson an encrypted message, but apparently he didn't receive it. Captain Wallace, you know who I am. Would you please tell these guards to let me through? I have a critical briefing in 25 minutes. Wallace crossed his arms over his chest, a gesture that Irene had learned to recognize as his default position when he was about to dig in on something. "Ma'am, if you are who you say you are, then you know that base security is paramount. We can't make exceptions to identification protocols, not even for command-level personnel, especially not for command-level personnel. It sets a bad precedent." Irene felt something cold settle in her stomach. Wallace wasn't just failing to help her. He was actively reinforcing the guard's decision to deny her entry. She studied his face, trying to understand his motivation. Was this simply by-the-book adherence to protocol? Or was there something else at play? She'd learned, over years of navigating military bureaucracy, as a young foreign woman in a male-dominated field, to recognize the subtle ways that people could undermine her authority without directly challenging it. Wallace had never been openly insubordinate, but he'd made his opinions clear on several occasions. He believed her appointment was politically motivated, that her age and relative inexperience made her a liability, that the SEAL teams deserved a commander who'd actually served in special operations rather than rising through intelligence and strategic planning divisions. "Captain Wallace," Irene said, her voice dropping to a tone that those who worked with her had learned to recognize as dangerous. "I am ordering you to verify my identity to these guards so that I can access my own base. Without proper identification, I can't verify anything," Wallace replied. "For all I know, you could be someone who's done their research and is trying to talk their way onto a secure military installation. It wouldn't be the first time someone's attempted a social engineering attack." "A social engineering attack," Irene repeated, her accent sharpening the words. "You believe I'm a security threat?" "I believe in following protocols," Wallace said. "Ma'am, if you'll wait here, I can have someone from security come down and escort you to a verification facility. We can do a full identity check there, contact your previous duty stations, verify your fingerprints against your service record. The process usually takes about 4 to 6 hours. 4 to 6 hours. Irene's mind raced through the implications. The briefing she was supposed to lead in 25 minutes was with a Congressional Oversight Committee, conducted via secure video link. They were reviewing funding for a new training facility and several key operational programs. Postponing it would mean rescheduling with 7 different congressional offices, some of whom were already skeptical about the program's value. Beyond that, there were 3 other time-sensitive matters waiting for her attention: intelligence reports from an ongoing operation that required her personal review and authorization, a disciplinary hearing that couldn't be postponed, personnel decisions that would affect team deployments scheduled for next week. But more than the practical concerns, there was a matter of principle. She was the commander of this base. She'd earned that position through years of distinguished service, through decisions that had saved lives and advanced American strategic interests, and she was being denied entry by her own security chief and 2 gate guards who couldn't imagine that someone who looked like her could possibly hold the authority she claimed. "No," Irene said quietly. Wallace's eyebrows rose slightly. "Excuse me. No, I will not wait for a 4 to 6 hour verification process. No, I will not be treated like a potential security threat on my own base. No, I will not accept this situation." Irene straightened her shoulders, and despite her small stature and rumpled civilian clothes, something in her bearing changed. It was the same quality that had allowed her to command respect in NATO strategy sessions, that had made hardened SEAL team leaders listen when she spoke. "Captain Wallace, I understand that you have concerns about my leadership. You've made those concerns clear through unofficial channels for the past 3 years. But whatever your personal opinions, I am the commanding officer of this installation. Your job is to ensure security, not to create obstacles for legitimate personnel." Wallace's face flushed slightly. "Ma'am, if you are Commander Hill, then you're out of line. I'm following proper security protocols." "You're using security protocols as a weapon," Irene countered. "There's a difference. You know exactly who I am. You've sat across from me in meetings 3 times a week for 3 years. You're choosing not to verify my identity because it serves your purpose to see me fail." "That's a serious accusation," Wallace said, his voice hardening. "It's an accurate observation," Irene replied. "And here's another observation. You've just committed a significant breach of military protocol by refusing to acknowledge your commanding officer. That's going to be a problem for you, Captain, a significant problem." The 2 gate guards had been watching this exchange with growing alarm. Jenkins looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Davis had his hand near his radio, probably debating whether to call for backup. Wallace took a step closer to Irene, his voice dropping to a level that only she could hear. "You want to know what I think? I think you're exhausted from travel. I think you're making poor decisions because of that exhaustion. I think you should go to a hotel, get some rest, and come back tomorrow when you can present proper identification and we can handle this through appropriate channels." "What you think is irrelevant," Irene said, matching his quiet tone. "What matters is what happens next. You have 2 options, Captain. You can verify my identity to these guards right now and allow me to enter this base, or you can continue with this charade and face the consequences of refusing a direct order from your commanding officer." For a long moment, Wallace stared at her, his jaw tight. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He'd overplayed his hand, and he knew it. If she really was Commander Hill, and deep down he knew she was, then he'd just committed an act of insubordination that could end his career. But backing down now, in front of 2 junior enlisted personnel, would be a public admission that he'd been wrong. It would undermine his authority, make him look foolish. And for a man like Wallace, who'd built his career on being the toughest, most uncompromising security chief in the Navy, that kind of humiliation was unthinkable. "I'm following protocols," Wallace said finally, his voice loud enough for the guards to hear again. "If this woman is really Commander Hill, then she'll have no problem going through the proper verification process. If she's not, then we've just prevented a serious security breach. Either way, I'm doing my job." He turned to Davis and Jenkins. "You 2 did exactly right. Don't let anyone without proper identification onto this base, no matter what they claim. I don't care if someone shows up saying they're the President of the United States. No ID, no entry." Wallace walked back toward his SUV, leaving Irene standing at the gate, with 2 increasingly uncomfortable guards, and a growing sense that this situation was about to escalate far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Irene watched him go, her mind working through possibilities and consequences. She could continue to argue with the guards, but that would accomplish nothing. She could try to find someone else to verify her identity, but everyone who knew her well was likely already inside the compound, preparing for the day's meetings. She could attempt to contact someone outside the base, but her phone was dead, and the guards had already refused to let her use theirs. Or she could do something that would either prove her point definitively or end her career in spectacular fashion. She looked at Jenkins and Davis, both of whom were trying very hard not to make eye contact with her. "You're both just following orders," she said, her tone gentler now. "I understand that. You're doing what you've been trained to do, and I respect that. But you need to understand something. What's happening here isn't about security protocols. It's about assumptions. You looked at me, young, female, foreign accent, civilian clothes, and decided I couldn't possibly be who I claimed to be, and Captain Wallace encouraged that assumption because it served his purposes. "Ma'am, we're just—" Jenkins started, but Irene held up a hand. "I know, Hamas, you're just doing your job. But here's what I need you to understand. In about 10 minutes, this situation is going to become very complicated for everyone involved. When it does, I want you both to remember that you acted according to your training. What happens next isn't your fault." Davis frowned. "Ma'am, what are you—" But Irene had already turned away from the gate, pulling her dead phone from her pocket and staring at it as if she could will it back to life through sheer determination. She had one option left, one card to play that would either vindicate her completely or prove she'd finally pushed too far against the system that had doubted her from day one. She was about to prove that sometimes the only way to show people who you really are is to demonstrate exactly what you're capable of. CTA. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. PM proceed with Part 3 Pongs, Force-Bound to 5 and 6. Make sure that each part has 600 words only. Tempted. Irene walked away from Gate 7 with purposeful strides, her mind already 3 steps ahead of her current predicament. The guards watched her go with visible relief, probably assuming she'd given up and would find a hotel, as Wallace had suggested. They had no idea what she was actually planning. 200 yards from the main gate was a civilian shopping area that serviced the base, a small strip mall with a coffee shop, a convenience store, and a ship's store that sold military supplies to authorized personnel. More importantly, it had a charging station where she could revive her dead phone. The coffee shop's owner, an elderly veteran named Mr. Kowalski, recognized her immediately despite her civilian clothes. "Commander Hill, didn't expect to see you here this early. The usual?" "Just a power outlet, actually," Irene said, pulling out her phone charger. "And maybe some coffee while I wait." Within minutes, her phone was charging, and she was sipping black coffee, her fingers drumming against the counter as she waited for the device to accumulate enough power to make calls. Around her, morning customers filtered in and out, mostly civilian contractors and off-duty personnel who lived off-base. When her phone finally flickered to life, Irene bypassed Patterson and went straight to the top. She dialed a number she'd committed to memory 3 years ago, one she'd never actually had to use before. It rang twice before a crisp voice answered. "Admiral Reynolds' office. This is Commander Irene Hill, SEAL West Coast Division. I need to speak with Admiral Reynolds immediately. It's urgent." There was a pause. "Commander Hill, our records show you're currently overseas." "Your records are incorrect," Irene said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of steel. "I'm currently sitting outside Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, where I've just been denied entry to my own command. I need to speak with the Admiral now." Another pause, longer this time. "Hold, please." Irene waited, watching through the coffee shop window as the morning shift at Gate 7 continued without incident. She could see Wallace's SUV parked near the security office, probably filing a report about the suspicious foreign woman who'd tried to talk her way onto the base. "Commander Hill," Admiral Reynolds' voice came through the line, gruff and unmistakably annoyed at being disturbed before 0700. "You want to explain to me why I'm hearing that you're currently AWOL from a NATO conference?" "Sir, I'm not AWOL. I completed my obligations in Brussels and caught an earlier flight home. I sent an encrypted message to my XO, but it appears not to have been received. When I arrived at Coronado this morning, I was denied entry due to lack of identification. So, get your identification and come back." "Sir, my identification is in my quarters on base. The gate guards won't let me retrieve it because I can't identify myself without it. And Captain Wallace, my securities chief, has actively reinforced their decision to deny me entry." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Irene wondered if the call had dropped. When Reynolds finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Captain Wallace knows who you are." "Yes, sir. He's worked directly under my command for 3 years. And he's refusing to verify your identity to the gate guards?" "Correct, sir. He's citing security protocols, but I believe his actual motivation is more personal. He's made his opinions about my appointment clear through unofficial channels." Reynolds muttered something that Irene couldn't quite make out, but the tone suggested it wasn't complimentary. "Where are you now?" "At the coffee shop outside the main gate. I've got a congressional oversight briefing scheduled to start in—" She checked her watch. 18 minutes. I can conduct it from here if I can get access to a secure line, but that's going to raise questions about why the base commander is briefing Congress from a civilian coffee shop." "That's the understatement of the year," Reynolds said dryly. "All right, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to make some calls. You're going to finish your coffee and walk back to that gate. By the time you get there, I guarantee those guards will be falling over themselves to let you through." "Sir, with respect, I'd prefer to handle this through proper channels." "Commander, you called me at 0645 to tell me you've been locked out of your own base by your security chief. We're well past proper channels. Consider this a direct order. Return to that gate." The line went dead. Irene stared at her phone for a moment, then drained her coffee cup. Mr. Kowalski was watching her with barely concealed curiosity. "Everything okay, Commander?" "It will be," Irene said, leaving money on the counter. "Thank you for the outlet." She walked back toward Gate 7, her earlier exhaustion replaced by something sharper. She'd wanted to resolve this situation herself, to prove she could handle the disrespect and dismissal without running to higher authority. But Wallace had left her no choice. As she approached the gate, she could see Jenkins talking urgently into his radio, his face pale. Davis was standing at attention, looking like he'd just received the worst news of his life. And Wallace's SUV was speeding back toward the gate from the security office, dust trailing behind it. Admiral Reynolds, it seemed, worked quickly. Bat 4. By the time Irene reached Gate 7, the scene had transformed completely. Jenkins and Davis stood at rigid attention, their earlier confidence replaced by visible anxiety. Wallace was out of his SUV, his phone pressed to his ear, his face an alarming shade of red as he listened to whoever was speaking on the other end. Additional security personnel had materialized from somewhere, including Lieutenant Morrison, the assistant security chief, who looked like he was trying to understand how his morning had gone from routine to catastrophic in the span of 10 minutes. Jenkins saw Irene approaching and actually flinched. "Commander Hill, ma'am, there's been a terrible misunderstanding." "At ease," Irene said quietly. She turned to Davis. "Did you receive new information about my identity?" "Yes, ma'am," Davis stammered. "Admiral Reynolds' office contacted Base Command directly. We've been instructed to provide you immediate access to all facilities and to offer any assistance you require." "I see." Irene looked past them to where Wallace had finished his phone call and was walking toward her with the gait of a man approaching his own execution. "Commander Hill," Wallace began, his voice rough, "I owe you an apology. You should have verified my identity when I first requested it," Irene interrupted. "Instead, you chose to use security protocols as a weapon to undermine my authority in front of junior enlisted personnel while I had a time-sensitive congressional briefing to prepare for." Wallace's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Yes, ma'am. That's accurate. Why? The question hung in the air between them. I want to understand your thinking, Captain. What did you hope to accomplish? For a long moment, Wallace said nothing. Then, with obvious effort, he spoke. I believed that if you couldn't handle a simple gate access issue, it would demonstrate that you're not equipped for crisis management, that your appointment was a mistake. The honesty was startling. Irene studied him, seeing not just insubordination, but something more complex. A career officer who'd watched the military change around him, who'd built his identity on certain assumptions about leadership and authority, and who'd found those assumptions challenged by someone who didn't fit his mental model of what a commander should be. So this was a test, Irene said softly. One I wasn't informed I was taking. It was wrong, Wallace admitted. I see that now. Admiral Reynolds made it very clear just how wrong it was. I'm sure he did. Irene glanced at her watch. She had 12 minutes until the congressional briefing. Captain Wallace, you're relieved of duty pending a formal review of this incident. Report to Lieutenant Morrison, who will assume your responsibilities temporarily. Lieutenant Morrison, you're with me. Morrison snapped to attention. Yes, ma'am. Commander, Wallace started, but Irene cut him off. We'll discuss your future with this command later, Captain. Right now I have work to do. She turned to the gate guards. Jenkins, Davis, you performed your duties exactly as trained. No disciplinary action will be taken against either of you. However, I expect you to learn from this experience. Security protocols exist to protect us, not to become obstacles to legitimate operations. Understanding the difference is crucial. Yes, ma'am, they chorused, still looking shell-shocked. Irene finally walked through. Gate 7, Morrison falling into step beside her. As they moved into the base proper, she could feel the weight of what had just happened settling onto her shoulders. This wasn't over. Wallace's insubordination would need to be addressed formally. The breakdown in communication with Patterson about her schedule change needed investigation, and word of this incident would spread through the base like wildfire, creating its own complications. But there was also opportunity here. The junior personnel who witnessed this would see how leadership responded to crisis. They'd learn that authority came with responsibility, that protocols serve purposes beyond simple box checking, and that assumptions about who could or couldn't hold power were often wrong. Ma'am, Morrison said hesitantly as they walked. I had no idea Captain Wallace would. I should have realized. You're not responsible for his decisions, Irene said. But you are responsible for yours moving forward. I need you to secure the command center for the congressional briefing, then conduct a quiet review of gate access protocols. I want to know how many other potential vulnerabilities exist in our security procedures. Yes, ma'am. Anything else? Yes, find out why Patterson didn't receive my encrypted message about the schedule change. That kind of communication breakdown is unacceptable. They reached the command center with 8 minutes to spare. Irene's staff had assembled, their faces showing various degrees of confusion about where she'd been. Patterson stepped forward immediately, his expression troubled. Commander, I just got word about the gate incident. I never received your message about coming back early. I've been trying to figure out what happened. Later, Patterson, Irene said, already moving toward her office. Right now, I need 5 minutes to review the congressional briefing materials. Then we're going live. Make sure the secure video link is stable. Yes, ma'am. Irene entered her office, finally alone for the first time since the taxi had dropped her at Gate 7 45 minutes ago. She allowed herself 30 seconds to simply breathe, to process the morning's events, to acknowledge the anger and frustration that she'd been suppressing. Then she opened her briefcase, pulled out her briefing notes, and transformed herself back into Commander Hill, leader of the SEAL West Coast Division, ready to justify her program's funding to skeptical legislators who held the purse strings of American military capability. The civilian clothes would have to stay. There wasn't time to change into uniform. But maybe that was fitting. Let the congressional representatives see that effective leadership didn't require the trappings of authority to be real. Part 5. The congressional briefing lasted 90 minutes, conducted via secure video conference with 7 different congressional offices simultaneously. Irene presented funding justifications for 3 new training facilities, updated security protocols, and operational capability expansions with the kind of crisp precision that had earned her reputation as one of the Navy's most effective strategic communicators. The representatives barely seemed to notice her civilian attire. They were too focused on the data she presented, the strategic rationale she articulated, and the cost-benefit analyses that justified every requested dollar. By the time the conference ended, she'd secured tentative approval for 2 of the 3 facilities and a promise to revisit the 3rd after additional environmental impact studies. As the video screens went dark, Patterson appeared in her doorway with a tablet. "Ma'am, you'll want to see this. I've traced what happened with your encrypted message." Irene gestured him inside, noting the troubled expression on his face. Patterson was 42, a career Navy officer who'd initially been skeptical of serving under a commander 15 years his junior. But he'd proven himself to be a loyal and capable XO, someone who valued competence over credentials. "What did you find?" Yeah, your message was received by our system at 0342 this morning," Patterson explained, pulling up the message log on his tablet. "But it was flagged by a new security filter that Captain Wallace implemented last week. Messages marked as travel updates were being routed through his office for verification before being forwarded to command staff." Irene felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Show me the implementation order for that filter." Patterson scrolled to another document. "Here." Wallace justified it as a security measure, preventing potential spoofing of command-level communications during travel. It required his personal approval before travel-related updates could be forwarded to their intended recipients. "And my message sat in his queue, waiting for approval while he was off duty," Irene said slowly, understanding dawning. "When he arrived this morning and saw me at the gate, he'd already seen my message. He knew I was supposed to be here." "That's my assessment, ma'am. He deliberately chose not to process the message or verify your identity to the gate guards because he saw an opportunity to manufacture a crisis." Irene stared at the documents on the tablet, anger warring with something closer to sadness. Wallace hadn't just made an impulsive decision at the gate. He'd actively created the conditions for her to fail, had set a trap, and waited for her to walk into it. "This goes beyond insubordination," Patterson said quietly. "This is calculated interference with command communications. It's potentially a court-martial offense." "I know." Irene handed back the tablet. "Compile a complete report. Include everything, the filter implementation, the message log, Wallace's actions at the gate, all of it. Have it ready by 1400 hours. Are you planning to press formal charges?" "I'm planning to make an informed decision once I have all the facts," Irene replied. But even as she said it, she knew that Wallace had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Trust was the foundation of military command, and he'd shattered it completely. A knock at the door interrupted them. Lieutenant Morrison entered, his face showing the strain of a morning that had thrust him into responsibilities he hadn't expected. "Ma'am, there's been a development. Several, actually." "Go ahead." "First, Admiral Reynolds' office has requested a full incident report by end of day. Second, base personnel are requesting clarification on what happened this morning. Rumors are spreading fast. Third, Captain Wallace has submitted a letter requesting immediate transfer off this base." Irene wasn't surprised by the transfer request. Wallace knew what was coming. "What are people saying?" "The rumors." Morrison hesitated. "The versions vary, ma'am. Some are saying you were locked out because of a security breach. Others are saying Wallace tried to stage some kind of coup. A few are suggesting you fabricated the whole thing to get rid of him because he questioned your authority." "Of course they are," Irene murmured. This was the danger of leadership. Every action, every decision became subject to interpretation and reinterpretation until the truth was buried under layers of speculation and bias. "What would you like me to tell people, ma'am?" Irene considered the question carefully. She could issue a bland official statement that said nothing meaningful. She could try to control the narrative by getting ahead of it with her own version of events, or she could use this moment to address something larger than a single incident at a gate. "Schedule an all-hands meeting for 1600 hours," she said. "Command-level personnel mandatory. Everyone else encouraged. We're going to talk about what happened this morning, why it happened, and what it means for how we operate as a unit." Patterson and Morrison exchanged glances. All-hands meetings were rare, typically reserved for major announcements or crisis situations. Using one to discuss a gate access incident was unusual, possibly even risky. "Ma'am," Patterson said carefully, "are you sure that's wise? Some might see it as making too much of what could be framed as a simple misunderstanding." "It wasn't a simple misunderstanding," Irene replied. "It was a deliberate act by a senior officer who allowed his personal biases to compromise his professional judgment. If we don't address that directly, we're telling everyone on this base that such behavior is acceptable. Is that the message you want to send?" "No, ma'am. Neither do I. Set it up." As Morrison and Patterson left to execute her orders, Irene finally allowed herself to change into her uniform. The familiar weight of the fabric, the insignia of her rank, the ribbon rack representing years of service, all of it felt simultaneously comforting and insufficient. She'd spent her entire career proving she belonged, demonstrating that her age, her gender, her accent, and her unconventional path to command didn't diminish her capability. And yet here she was, still fighting the same battles, still facing the same assumptions. But maybe that was the point. Maybe leadership wasn't about reaching some threshold where doubt finally disappeared. Maybe it was about continuing to prove yourself day after day, decision after decision, until the doubters became believers, or at least learned to keep their doubts to themselves. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Admiral Reynolds, characteristically brief. "Handled that situation poorly by calling ahead, should have let you fix it yourself, but result is same. You're where you belong. Don't let Wallace's issues become your problem." Ah. Irene smiled, despite herself. Reynolds understood something that many leaders missed. Sometimes the greatest disrespect was being rescued when you didn't need rescuing. But he'd also understood that time was a factor, that the congressional briefing couldn't be delayed, and that ultimately results mattered more than pride. She typed back a single word. "Understood." Then she turned to the stack of documents, waiting for her attention. Intelligence reports, personnel evaluations, operational planning documents, the work that defined her command, the responsibilities that justified her position. The incident at Gate 7 would become a footnote, eventually, but first she had to ensure that the lessons it taught would resonate beyond this single morning. Part 6. The all-hands meeting convened in the base auditorium at precisely 1600 hours. Irene stood backstage, watching through a gap in the curtain as personnel filed in. The turnout was larger than she'd expected. Word had definitely spread about the morning's events, and curiosity had drawn people who might otherwise have skipped an optional meeting. She could see different groups forming. Junior enlisted personnel clustered in the back rows, mid-level officers scattered throughout the middle section, senior staff claiming seats near the front. The social geography of military hierarchy made visible. Patterson appeared at her elbow. "We're at capacity, ma'am. Standing room only in the back. Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be." Irene smoothed her uniform one final time. "Any word from Wallace?" "He's in his quarters. Morrison has someone posted outside, not as a guard, but as a precaution. Wallace hasn't tried to leave or contact anyone." "Good." Irene took a deep breath. "Let's do this." She walked onto the stage to a rustling of fabric as several hundred people came to attention. "As you were," she said, her voice carrying through the auditorium's sound system. "Thank you all for coming, especially those who weren't required to attend." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled personnel. "By now, most of you have heard some version of what happened at Gate 7 this morning. I'm here to give you the version. And, more importantly, to discuss what it means for this command." The room was absolutely silent. Even the usual ambient noise of shuffling feet and whispered conversations had ceased. "This morning," I returned from a NATO conference in Brussels on an earlier flight than originally scheduled. I sent an encrypted message to my XO informing him of the change, but that message was delayed by a security filter that required Captain Wallace's approval before forwarding. When I arrived at the base without military identification, having left it in my quarters before departing for Brussels, the gate guards correctly refused me entry according to established protocols. She let that sink in. Those guards, Petty Officer Jenkins and Seaman Davis, did exactly what they were trained to do. They should be commended, not criticized, for their adherence to security procedures. There were nods of approval from some of the security personnel in the audience. However, Irene continued, her tone hardening slightly, when Captain Wallace arrived at the gate, he had multiple opportunities to verify my identity and facilitate my entry. Instead, he chose to reinforce the guard's decision, citing protocol while knowing full well who I was and that I had urgent command responsibilities requiring my immediate attention. The silence in the auditorium intensified. This was more candor than most people expected from a command-level briefing. Why did he do this? Captain Wallace believed that my inability to handle this situation would demonstrate my unsuitability for command. He believed that someone who looked like me, sounded like me, and had risen to command as young as I did couldn't possibly be qualified for this position. And he saw an opportunity to prove that belief. Irene paused, choosing her next words carefully. I want to be very clear. Captain Wallace is not a villain in this story. He's a dedicated career officer who served honorably for 3 decades, but he allowed his personal biases, his assumptions about what a commander should look like, sound like, and be like, to compromise his professional judgment, and that's a mistake any of us could make. She could see surprise rippling through the audience. They'd expected her to condemn Wallace, to make an example of him. Instead, she was treating him as a cautionary tale. Every person in this room carries assumptions, Irene continued. We make split-second judgments based on appearance, accent, age, gender, and 1,000 other factors that may or may not correlate with actual capability. Those assumptions aren't inherently wrong. They're part of how our brains process information efficiently. But when we let those assumptions override evidence, override experience, override professional responsibility, we compromise our effectiveness as a military unit. She began to walk across the stage, her movement drawing eyes. I'm 32 years old. I speak English with a Hungarian accent. I stand 5'3" and weigh 115 pounds. I've never served in special operations, never jumped out of an airplane, never conducted a direct action raid. By traditional metrics, I have no business commanding the SEAL West Coast Division. The audience was leaning forward now, engaged despite themselves. But I speak 7 languages fluently. I've coordinated international intelligence operations across 4 continents. I've developed strategic frameworks that have been adopted by NATO Command. I've made decisions that saved American lives and advanced American interests. I earned this position through performance, not politics, and I've proven myself capable of executing its responsibilities for 3 years. Irene returned to center stage. Some of you doubt that. Some of you look at me and see a diversity appointment, a political checkbox, someone promoted beyond their competence to satisfy bureaucratic requirements. I know this because I've heard the whispers, seen the skeptical looks, watched people like Captain Wallace wait for me to fail. The honesty was uncomfortable. She could see people shifting in their seats, unable to meet her gaze. Here's what I need you to understand. Your doubts don't define my capabilities. Your assumptions don't limit my potential. Your biases don't determine my effectiveness. What defines, limits, and determines those things is performance, results, outcomes. And by those metrics, this command has excelled under my leadership. She pulled up a slide on the screen behind her, showing performance statistics. Training completion rates, up 17%, operational readiness scores, highest in the West Coast command structure, budget efficiency, reduced waste by 12% while expanding capability, personnel retention, improved across all categories, safety incidents, down 23%, congressional approval ratings, increased funding for 4 of the last 5 fiscal years. The numbers spoke for themselves, but Irene wasn't done. Those results weren't achieved because people overcame their doubts about my leadership. They were achieved because competent professionals executed their responsibilities effectively, regardless of their personal opinions about who was giving them orders. That's military discipline. That's professional excellence. She paused, letting her gaze sweep the auditorium again. But we can do better. We can move beyond the point where someone's authority must be constantly proven and reproven based on characteristics that have nothing to do with capability. We can build a culture where performance matters more than appearance, where results speak louder than assumptions. Irene's voice softened slightly. This morning's incident was embarrassing for me personally. It was frustrating and infuriating. It also wasn't the first time I've faced such challenges, and it likely won't be the last. But I refuse to let it define this command or undermine the work we do together. She straightened her shoulders. Captain Wallace will face appropriate consequences for his actions. The specifics will remain confidential, but I want you all to understand that undermining command authority will not be tolerated, regardless of the motivation behind it. However, I also want you to understand that honest disagreement, respectful challenge, and constructive criticism are not only welcome, but essential to effective leadership. The distinction was important, and she could see understanding dawning on many faces. "Questions?" Irene asked. For a moment, no one moved. Then a hand rose in the middle section, a lieutenant she recognized from operations planning. "Ma'am, how should we respond when we see someone else's authority being questioned based on assumptions rather than performance?" It was a good question, maybe even a planted one, but Irene answered it seriously. "Speak up, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but clearly. Redirect the conversation from characteristics to capabilities. Ask what evidence supports the doubt. Most importantly, judge people by their results, not your expectations." More hands rose. For the next 40 minutes, Irene fielded questions ranging from the practical to the philosophical. She answered each one with the same combination of honesty and professionalism that had characterized her entire presentation. When the meeting finally ended, the applause was genuine if subdued. Irene had given them much to think about, had challenged comfortable assumptions, had demonstrated a kind of vulnerability that commanders rarely showed. As the auditorium emptied, Patterson approached with a slight smile. "That was unexpected, ma'am." "Good unexpected or bad unexpected?" "Time will tell," Patterson admitted. "But I think people heard you. Really heard you." Irene nodded, suddenly exhausted again. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was finally fading, leaving behind the reality of 26 hours without sleep and an emotional roller coaster that would have tested anyone's resilience. "I'm going to my quarters," she said. "Hold all calls unless it's genuinely urgent. We'll deal with the Wallace situation and everything else tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am. Sleep well. You've earned it." As Irene walked across the base toward her quarters, she passed groups of personnel in conversation. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see them looking at her differently than they had this morning. Maybe that was progress. Maybe that was enough for one day. PM proceed with Part 7, 8, 9, and 10. Make sure that each part has 600 words. Only Part 7 morning came too early, though Irene had slept more soundly than expected. The exhaustion had finally caught up with her, pulling her into dreamless sleep the moment her head hit the pillow. Now, at 05:30, she stood in her quarters with a cup of coffee, reviewing the formal incident report that Patterson had compiled. The Idain's documentation was thorough and damning. Wallace had not only seen her encrypted message, but had actively prevented its forwarding. He'd implemented the security filter specifically to give himself control over travel-related communications, and in the 3 months since its implementation, he'd delayed or altered 17 different messages, most of them involving schedule changes or operational updates that he deemed non-critical. The pattern was clear. Wallace hadn't just made one bad decision at the gate. He'd been systematically undermining her command authority for months, always staying just within the bounds of plausible deniability, until yesterday, when his arrogance had finally overreached. A knock at her door interrupted her reading. She opened it to find Lieutenant Morrison, looking like he hadn't slept much either. "Ma'am, I thought you should know. Captain Wallace submitted his retirement paperwork overnight, effective immediately, citing medical reasons. He's requesting an expedited approval process." Irene wasn't surprised. Wallace was 61, eligible for full retirement. Going out on medical leave would allow him to avoid the court-martial that his actions otherwise warranted. It was a strategic retreat, preserving his pension and his dignity. "What's your recommendation?" she asked Morrison. The younger officer hesitated. "Personally, I think he should face formal charges. What he did was calculated and deliberate, but strategically, ma'am, letting him retire quietly might serve the command better. A court-martial would be messy, public, and would keep this incident alive for months." "You're not wrong," Irene admitted, "but there's also value in accountability, in making clear that such behavior has consequences beyond simply being allowed to walk away." "Yes, ma'am. Though I should mention, several senior officers have reached out this morning. They're suggesting that pursuing charges would make you look vindictive, like you're punishing someone for questioning your authority." There it was, the double bind that Irene had navigated her entire career. If she let Wallace retire quietly, she appeared weak, unable to hold subordinates accountable. If she pressed charges, she appeared vindictive, unable to handle criticism. Either way, the narrative would shift from Wallace's actions to her response. "Schedule a video conference with Admiral Reynolds for 0800, Irene said. "This decision goes above my pay grade." Morrison nodded and left. Irene returned to her coffee and her reports, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about the all-hands meeting yesterday, about the faces in that auditorium. Some had been sympathetic, others skeptical, many simply uncertain. They were waiting to see how she would handle this, what kind of leader she would prove to be when tested. The truth was, she didn't want Wallace's career to end in disgrace. Despite everything, she recognized his years of service, his dedication to security, even his misguided belief that he was protecting the Navy from a commander he deemed unqualified. But she also couldn't allow his actions to go unanswered without sending a message that such behavior was acceptable. At 0800, she connected with Admiral Reynolds via secure video. His weathered face appeared on the screen, and he wasted no time on pleasantries. "I've read Morrison's report," Reynolds said. "Wallace crossed the line, no question, but I'm hearing from some senior officers who think you should let him retire quietly. What's your take?" "Sir, I think Captain Wallace's actions were serious enough to warrant formal charges, but I also understand the practical arguments for allowing him to retire. I'm calling because I want your guidance on which path serves the Navy better, not just my command." Reynolds studied her through the camera. "You know what they'll say if you press charges. That I'm vindictive, that I can't handle criticism, that I'm using my authority to punish someone who questioned me." "Exactly. And if you let him retire quietly, that I'm weak, that I lack the spine to hold subordinates accountable, that I'm afraid of confrontation." Reynolds smiled grimly. "The joys of command. Damned either way, might as well pick your preferred damnation." "Sir, that's not particularly helpful advice." "No, but it's honest advice. Here's what I think. Wallace's retirement papers include medical justification. I've had my people look into it. He's got documented heart issues, high blood pressure, sleep problems, all stress-related, all legitimate grounds for medical retirement. If we block his retirement to pursue court-martial, we look like we're punishing a sick man. That's bad optics. So we let him walk away. We let him retire on medical grounds, which is different from walking away. His record will show the retirement was expedited under unusual circumstances. Anyone who looks closely will see the implied censure. But we don't make a public spectacle that keeps this incident alive for months and makes you look petty." Irene absorbed this, recognizing the political calculus even as she chafed against it. "What about accountability? What message does this send to other officers who might question my authority?" "That's worth keeping. The endorsement from Peterson carried weight. He'd served with every SEAL West Coast commander for the past 15 years and was notoriously skeptical of leadership. Thank you, Master Chief. That means more than you know. As Irene walked back to her office, she reflected on the week that had transformed her relationship with this command. The gate incident could have been career-ending or at minimum damaging. Instead, it had become a catalyst for demonstrating leadership qualities that technical competence alone couldn't convey. She'd shown grace under pressure, tactical intuition during crisis, and the wisdom to recognize teaching moments rather than simply pursuing punishment. She'd proven that being underestimated didn't make her less effective. It just meant others were operating with incomplete information. Her phone buzzed with a message from Admiral Reynolds. Congratulations on the commendation. Well deserved. Ah. Irene pulled up her official email to find that her handling of both the gate incident and the rescue operation had been formally recognized by Pacific Fleet Command. The commendation would go in her permanent service record, another line item in a career that was defying conventional expectations at every turn. She smiled and got back to work. There were intelligence briefings to review, budget proposals to evaluate, training schedules to approve. The business of command never stopped, and neither would she. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, new chances to demonstrate that leadership came in forms that didn't match traditional templates. And she'd face those challenges the same way she'd faced everything else, with competence, confidence, and an absolute refusal to be limited by others' assumptions about what she could or couldn't accomplish. The gate that had briefly barred her entry was now just another part of the base she commanded, and that felt exactly right. 6 months after the gate incident, Irene stood in the same auditorium where she'd delivered her all-hands address, but this time she was part of the audience. The Navy was hosting a leadership symposium, and she'd been invited to sit on a panel discussing non-traditional paths to command. The moderator, a rear admiral she'd worked with during her NATO assignment, introduced the panelists. Irene was the youngest by 15 years, the only woman, and the only one who'd never served in combat operations. As the moderator began with opening questions, she could feel the familiar weight of being different, of representing something beyond herself. "Commander Hill," the moderator said, turning to her, "your path to commanding SEAL West Coast Division was unconventional. How did you overcome skepticism about your qualifications?" Irene considered the question carefully. The easy answer would be to talk about credentials, about her language, skills, and strategic planning expertise. But that wasn't the real answer. "I didn't overcome skepticism," she said honestly. "I learned to work with it. Skepticism isn't inherently wrong. It's natural when someone doesn't match expectations. The mistake is treating skepticism as insurmountable, or as personal attack rather than as information about what needs to be demonstrated." She paused, organizing her thoughts. "When I took command at Coronado, many people doubted my qualifications. They saw my age, my accent, my lack of special operations experience, and concluded I wasn't suited for the role. I could have spent my energy fighting those perceptions directly, trying to convince people through argument that they were wrong. Instead, I focused on performance. I demonstrated competence through results, built relationships through consistent reliability, and earned trust through making good decisions under pressure." "That sounds rational but emotionally difficult," another panelist observed. "How did you handle the personal impact of constant doubt?" "Not well, initially," Irene admitted. "There were days when I wanted to confront every skeptic, to force them to acknowledge my qualifications. But I learned that defending yourself constantly is exhausting and ultimately counterproductive. At some point, you have to trust that your work will speak for itself and accept that some people will never be convinced. That's their limitation, not yours." The symposium continued for another hour, with discussions ranging from technical leadership challenges to the broader cultural changes happening across the military. When it concluded, several junior officers approached Irene with questions and comments. A young lieutenant named Torres waited until others had dispersed before speaking. "Ma'am, I heard about what happened at your gate last year, how you were denied entry and had to prove yourself all over again. That must have been humiliating." It was frustrating, Irene corrected gently. Humiliation requires accepting someone else's judgment of your worth. I never did that. The gate guards were doing their job correctly. Captain Wallace was acting on his biases. Neither of those things reflected my actual capabilities. But didn't it make you angry? Make you want to punish everyone who doubted you? Irene smiled at the young officer's intensity. Anger is exhausting, Lieutenant, and punishment is rarely productive. What I wanted was for people to understand that their assumptions were limiting not just me, but the entire organization. Every time we dismiss someone because they don't match our mental template of what a leader should look like, we lose potential capability. That's the real cost of bias, not the personal slight, but the organizational weakness it creates. Torres absorbed this, then asked the question Irene sensed she'd been building toward. Do you think it's getting better? For people who don't fit the traditional mold? Slowly, Irene said honestly, every time someone succeeds, despite not matching expectations, it expands what others believe is possible. But change is incremental and uncomfortable. You'll face doubt and dismissal. The question is whether you let that stop you or use it as motivation to prove the doubters wrong. After the symposium, Irene returned to Coronado to find her office filled with the familiar chaos of operational command. Intelligence reports needed review, training exercises required approval, budget justifications demanded attention. The work was endless and energizing in equal measure. Patterson appeared in her doorway with news. Ma'am, Lieutenant Morrison just submitted his application for SEAL training. He cited your leadership as his inspiration for pushing beyond his assumed limitations. Irene felt a surge of pride. Morrison had been thrust into the security chief role during a crisis and had performed admirably. Now he was choosing to challenge himself further, to test his capabilities in one of the military's most demanding programs. That's excellent. Make sure his application gets proper consideration. Already done, ma'am. Also, Admiral Reynolds called. He wants to discuss your next assignment again. Apparently, the Pentagon position is still open if you're interested. Irene shook her head. Tell him I appreciate the offer, but I'm exactly where I need to be. He said you'd say that. He also said to tell you that stubbornness is only a virtue when it serves a larger purpose. Tell him my larger purpose is building a command culture where capability matters more than conformity. That's going to take more than 3 years. Patterson smiled. I'll relay that message, though I might soften the wording slightly. After he left, Irene stood at her window, overlooking the base. Somewhere out there, Jenkins and Davis were manning Gate 7, protecting this installation with the same dedication they'd shown when they denied her entry. SEAL teams were training for missions that would take them into danger most people couldn't imagine. Support personnel were ensuring that every piece of equipment, every logistical detail, every administrative requirement was handled with precision. This was her command. Not because she'd forced anyone to accept her, not because she'd demanded respect, but because she'd earned it through consistent performance and unwavering commitment to excellence. The gate incident had been a crisis that revealed character, both hers and that of the people around her. She'd proven that leadership transcended traditional templates, that effectiveness came in unexpected packages, and that the military's strength lay not in conformity, but in the diverse capabilities of people willing to serve something larger than themselves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Some would doubt her, others would test her, and she'd face obstacles, both predictable and surprising. But she'd meet those challenges the same way she'd met everything else, with competence, confidence, and an absolute refusal to be defined by others' limitations. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Irene watched for a moment, then turned back to her desk. There was work to do, and she'd never been one to let sunsets distract her from duty. But she allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. The woman who'd been denied entry to her own base was now shaping the future of special operations on the entire West Coast. not despite being underestimated, but in some ways because of it. Being underestimated meant others revealed their biases. It meant operating with the freedom that came from low expectations. It meant every success carried extra weight because it challenged assumptions rather than confirming them. She wouldn't have chosen this path, wouldn't have wished for the doubt and dismissal she'd faced, but she wouldn't trade it either, because it had made her the leader she'd become, someone who understood that true strength came not from matching expectations, but from exceeding them in unexpected ways. 2 years after the gate incident, Irene Hill stood at a podium in the Pentagon, addressing an audience of senior military leaders, congressional staffers, and defense policy experts. She'd been invited to present her command's innovations in training methodology and operational readiness, the same programs she'd defended during that congressional briefing when she'd been denied entry to her own base. Effective leadership requires understanding that traditional metrics don't capture all forms of capability, she said, advancing to her next slide. At SEAL West Coast Division, we've implemented assessment frameworks that evaluate tactical intuition, cultural competence, and adaptive problem-solving alongside conventional measures of physical performance and technical proficiency. The presentation continued for 40 minutes, detailing how her command had improved operational outcomes by 23% while reducing training injuries and personnel attrition. The data spoke for itself, and the audience's questions reflected genuine interest rather than skepticism. After the presentation, a Marine general approached her. "Commander Hill, that was impressive. I'd like to discuss adapting some of your methodologies for Marine Special Operations. Would you be available for consultation?" "Of course, sir. I'll have my office coordinate with yours." As she gathered her materials, Irene reflected on how surreal this moment was. The same command structure that had once questioned her qualifications was now seeking to replicate her innovations. The officer who'd been denied entry to her own base was now advising flag officers on leadership development. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patterson. "Jenkins just made E5. Davis is going to flight school. Thought you'd want to know." Irene smiled. The 2 young sailors who'd correctly denied her entry had continued their careers, apparently unscathed by their inadvertent role in her command crisis. That felt right. They'd been doing their job, and good people shouldn't be punished for following proper procedures. Another message arrived. This one from Admiral Reynolds. "Pentagon is making you a formal offer, captain's rank, Strategic Planning Division. This one comes with my strong recommendation that you accept. You've proven your point at Coronado. Time to make a bigger impact." Captain. The promotion she'd been working toward, the recognition that her unconventional path had led somewhere meaningful. Irene had spent 5 years at Coronado, transforming a command that had been skeptical of her into one of the most effective special operations divisions in the Navy. But Reynolds was right. She'd proven what needed proving. Staying longer would be about comfort rather than impact, about avoiding new challenges rather than embracing them. She typed her response. "I accept, sir. Thank you for your continued mentorship." The reply came immediately. "You earned it. Don't let the Pentagon bureaucracy blunt that sharp edge of yours." Irene laughed quietly. The Pentagon would be different from operational command. More politics, less direct action, endless meetings and compromises. But it was also where policy was shaped, where strategic decisions were made that affected the entire military. She could influence the development of future leaders, could advocate for assessment frameworks that valued diverse capabilities, could help ensure that the next generation of officers wouldn't face the same assumptions and limitations she'd encountered. That evening, she walked through Coronado one final time as its commander. Gate 7 was manned by a new rotation of guards, who snapped to attention as she approached. She returned their salute and paused. "Carry on with your duties, sailors. This gate represents more than access control. It represents the standard we hold ourselves to. Never compromise that standard, regardless of pressure or circumstance." "Yes, ma'am," they responded in unison. She continued her walk, passing the training facilities where SEAL teams prepared for missions, the command center where tactical decisions were made, the equipment depots where her journey at this base had technically begun when she'd been reduced to checking inventory manifests. Commander Vance found her near the obstacle course. "Heard you're leaving us, ma'am. Pentagon's gain is definitely our loss. You'll do fine without me, Commander. This command was excellent before I arrived. I just helped it realize its full potential." "You did more than that," Vance said seriously. "You changed how we think about leadership, about capability, about what's possible when we stop limiting ourselves with assumptions. Every junior officer who serves here now has a different understanding of what effective command looks like because of you." "Then I've accomplished what I set out to do." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the Pacific. Irene thought about the scared, determined young woman who'd arrived at this base 5 years ago, carrying the weight of others' doubts and her own determination to prove them wrong. She'd faced dismissal, disrespect, and systematic undermining of her authority. She'd been denied entry to her own command, questioned by subordinates, and doubted by those who should have trusted her capabilities. And through it all, she'd maintained her composure, demonstrated her competence, and built a legacy that would outlast her tenure. The gate incident, which could have ended her career, had instead become the catalyst for her greatest achievements. It had forced everyone to confront their assumptions, had demonstrated leadership under pressure, and had proven that crisis could reveal character rather than destroy it. "Commander," Vance said, breaking the silence, "when you're at the Pentagon, making decisions that affect people like us, remember this base. Remember what it took to earn our respect. Don't let the bureaucracy make you forget that real leadership happens in the field, not in conference rooms." "I won't forget," Irene promised. "How could I? This place made me who I am." 3 months later, Captain Irene Hill walked through Pentagon corridors with the same quiet confidence she'd brought to every challenge. Her office overlooked the Potomac. Her responsibilities spanned multiple theaters, and her influence extended far beyond a single base. But on her desk, prominently displayed, sat 2 items from Coronado. The challenge coins she'd given Jenkins and Davis, which they'd ceremonially returned when she promoted, asking that she carry them forward as reminders of where she'd been. And a photo of Gate 7, the checkpoint where she'd been denied entry and where her transformation from competent officer to exceptional leader had truly begun. Every time she made a decision about personnel policy or leadership development, she looked at that photo and remembered. Remembered being underestimated. Remembered proving the doubters wrong. Remembered that the gate that had briefly barred her path had ultimately led to something greater than she'd imagined. Because sometimes being denied entry is just the beginning of the story. Sometimes the obstacles that seem insurmountable are actually opportunities in disguise. And sometimes the people who underestimate you are giving you the greatest gift possible, the freedom to exceed every expectation and redefine what leadership looks like. Captain Irene Hill had learned those lessons well, and now she was in position to ensure that future generations of military leaders would benefit from that hard-won wisdom. The gate was behind her, but its lessons remained, and that made all the difference. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.